Welcome back to the Monday Morning Point Guard podcast. On today's episode, going to be discussing super teams and mainly in the context of this modern idea of it. The idea that you can basically throw a team together overnight in terms of like a big three and be competitive right away, and how that approach is overrated. If you did enjoy the video, please be sure to like it as well as subscribe for weekly content. Also, the podcasts are now up on Spotify, so you can listen to the full episode uninterrupted there. And if there's a spot you agree with, disagree with, either reach out to us on Twitter or in that comment section, and we'd love to discuss with you. So super teams overrated. It sounds like a really controversial statement, but more specifically, I'm just talking about like this modern big three super team approach to team building. The Daryl Morey approach, like let's just get stars in here and then figure the rest out later. I personally like the more homegrown approach. I just feel like that's more effective for dynasty building. Where are you at on this, Clayton?
Yeah, I agree. I think you've seen a lot of success in the home growing method. And it really doesn't always work out the way you think it is when you're going to throw a bunch of stars together when there's injuries or maybe they just don't mesh well, as we've seen this year.
Yeah, definitely. But it's not hard to understand like the appeal of putting together like a big three or a super team. But we need to look at how successful it actually is. So kind of let's start by defining what we mean. So what do we mean by overrated? What is going to qualify as this modern super team, big three template? And then also just what is a dynasty? So what is a big three or like a super team in terms of the modern context? What does that kind of mean to you?
I mean, if you have three guys who they're for sure going to be the all-star, they're going to be on the all-NBA team, they're big names in the league, and you kind of throw them together either through a blockbuster trade or just a monster signing in the offseason with the intent to form a big three. I mean, that's kind of what we've been seeing teams do. And it just doesn't always work out the way that they think it is.
Yeah, and that's pretty much exactly what I had. For me, it was just the idea that you can add three established stars to a team and just become a contender basically overnight, either via free agency or through trade. If you have
on
one
paper,
guy,
they might be a contender.
right, yeah, the idea is to turn into a contender
Yeah.
overnight. And I think if you have one guy and you're just adding two more, I think that still kind of fits the template. Even if you have a duo and you're adding a third, depending on what you're kind of giving up in that process to get the third, I would even kind of throw it under that umbrella. So obviously we have the big three Celtics with KG, Allen, and Pierce. That would be one that I would consider. I understand Pierce was already there, but the other two were added via trade, and it drastically changed the way that they played as a team. The big three Heat, Miami with Wade, Bosh, LeBron, they were all put together via free agency. I would also consider the LeBron Cavs with Love and Kyrie as part of this super team template or big three template. And then obviously we have the most recent example with the Harden, Kyrie, Durant Nets. Any other teams that you think should be included in that under that template, just as at the top of your head?
I mean, I think the Lakers tried to do that
This year?
It obviously, yeah. I mean, I think that was the intent. It obviously didn't work out for them very well. They're
No.
pretty much at the bottom of the playoffs right now.
Yeah, I think they're going to get in just because I've talked about it some. I think the Blazers are looking to get out. And so unless the Kings go on a really substantial run, like that's basically the team that would have to pass them. And I just don't see that happening. So they're likely in the play-in. But not to get off on the rails here. Next, I want to talk about what is a dynasty. So what constitutes a dynasty, do you think? Like what accomplishments do they have to be considered a dynasty?
I would think at least conference finals pretty consistently. And it's kind of the core of your team staying together throughout that whole time. You're not really just like shuffling players around. You kind of keeping that strong core. I would think at least the conference finals is where they should go if it's a dynasty.
How many titles do you think a team should win to be considered dynastic?
In like a 3 or 4 year period, I would think at least two.
See, I
in a
think
row, probably.
I think it's three because
Three.
And just because if you think about the 94, I believe 94 and 95 Rockets, like they go back to back with Hakeem Olajuwon, but I don't think we would consider that a dynasty, even though they were really competitive throughout that time. They were still making conference finals and like having some deepish runs in the playoffs. But I don't think we would consider them a dynasty. Whereas like the Kobe Shaq Lakers, I think we would consider them a dynasty. They won 3. So I think 3 is the cutoff, at least for me. And just, yeah, like you mentioned, has to be one within like a reasonable window, and then relatively the same core group of guys. So under that guys, I wouldn't consider like the Heat big 3 a dynasty, the 2 titles in 4 years. I just don't think it was long enough at the top and enough titles. I think if they win the third, be it the Mavericks or the second Spurs rematch, I think then we probably would. Lakers Kobe Shaq thing, like I mentioned, I would consider that, but I don't consider the other 2 titles that Kobe won with Gasol as a part of that Laker dynasty. I just think they're too far apart, and the teams were like very different, obviously, between the Kobe Shaq Lakers and then the Kobe Gasol ones. The Spurs, I had no idea how to like define their window of dynasty. I guess I would consider the 99 title part of theirs, and I don't think I would the 14 title. I guess the argument against the 99 team is it was very different than the one that was winning in the 2000s. Like, I don't think Manu or Tony were there, or if they were, they weren't really having like a big role with that group. And then 14, it was just so far in between that one and the 07 title that I don't know. Not a hill I'm willing to die on, though. How do you feel about the Spurs? Like, what do you feel their dynasty window is? I feel like they're obviously a dynasty.
Yeah, they feel like a dynasty just because, it was Pop that whole time. It was Tim Duncan that entire stretch. They had TP and Manu. So it feels like over that like 10-year period, they were a dynasty. But the titles being, that far apart, I don't know if one would make the argument for that. It seems like just since they had that same team together over that stretch and they were pretty successful that whole time.
I think you could include either the 99 or the 14 title in like a Spurs dynasty, but I don't think both. I think you could make a good argument for either to be included, but not both. I just
You
think
would probably do the 14 one then, because that's, that had most of the team or the players that were winning all those titles.
Yeah, I don't know. Duncan really wasn't the focal point anymore by 14. He was like still really good, but he was more of just like, he wasn't posting up anymore. It was just like screen and roll for him. I don't know. I have no idea what to do with them. I guess also worth mentioning the Bulls, their 6 titles, I consider part of the same dynasty. It was 6 and 8 years. I think even though you're swapping out Horace Grant and Dennis Rodman, I still think it's relatively the same team, even though a lot of the role guys were interchangeable, but they were playing very similarly. I mean, you kind of knew what you were getting no matter who they had on the court with Jordan and Pippen. So let's move on to what we mean by overrated. I think it's more specific to the media here, because whenever ESPN or even Twitter, like their overreactions, whenever a team like this big 3 template gets put together, it's as if we shouldn't even bother having the season. Like, they're penciled in for the title. Everyone's already ready to crown them the next dynasty. And it's just rarely, if ever, the case that ends up happening. Yeah, obviously, in terms of getting just one title, it's somewhat effective, I would say. You can basically turn your mediocre team overnight, or even a bad team, into a title contender. Where the overrated piece comes in is just the expectations and whether or not it's worth leveraging your entire future of your franchise in order to do this. Since expectation seems to be to win multiple titles and build a dynasty whenever these teams are put together, it just never happens. And that's what makes it overrated in my mind.
Yeah, I agree. I think the reactions like right away are kind of what throws me off, because when you see an overnight trade, Russell Westbrook goes to the Lakers and everyone's ready to put them at the top of the West, myself included.
Yeah.
Just without thinking about how that would even work out with those players together, and just letting the season play out. Like, we were totally wrong on that.
Yeah, we were. And we were not alone in thinking that the Lakers would be really good this year. I knew that the fit was going to be a problem at some point. I just thought it was going to be late into the playoffs where like it would really unravel. I knew it was kind of inevitable that it would, but I just never imagined that during the regular season it would just unravel right from the start. Like, I thought there would be some like honeymoon period And then once the chips were really down and they were backed into a corner, that's when it came apart. But yeah, that was not the case this year.
See, I thought it would definitely start out bad, but then kind of work itself out as the season goes on because you see like when LeBron builds these new teams, they usually start out pretty rough.
That's true.
So I was thinking like, yeah, mixing Russ in would probably take some weeks to get those kinks out, and then they kind of figure it out. But AD gets hurt every other game. Russ shoots 4 for 20 every game, like
Yeah,
it's just not working out.
no, and they just had no flexibility come trade deadline to like do anything that was gonna
Yeah,
actually help them.
their whole payroll is those 3 players and then a bunch of minimum contracts. They don't really
Yeah,
have much to do.
yeah, there was really and no draft picks either.
Yeah.
So the actual reasons why I think this approach is overrated. Let's just go through some of the super teams and just kind of go team by team and see whether or not they lived up to expectations. I think it would be really hard to argue that the KD, Harden, Kyrie Nets lived up to the expectations. They only end up playing 16 games together. And there's a really strong possibility here that at least the KD Kyrie group never advances past the second round, let alone winning a title. Even if you're replacing Simmons for Harden, I think the Simmons thing is anything but a guarantee. And I've talked about that. It's just a huge assumption to feel like he's going to be the same player he was in Philly after everything he's been through, whether it be self-inflicted or not. And he's not played basketball in a year. So what are we expecting him to be? Also, given they're in the play-in right now, I don't think there's a real strong possibility they could get out of the play-in, but I think it's a long shot at this stage. They're going to get a brutal first round matchup, and the East is just a bloodbath through and through in the playoffs this year. If they pull an upset, they're likely going to be playing Philadelphia or the Bucks for their second round matchup. I guess if they fall into that 8 slot, they could be slotted against Chicago or Boston in the second round, but that's not an easy series either. And there's no guarantee they get Kyrie back next year. Durant's only getting older, so there's just, I think their best years for contention are kind of behind them at this stage. I don't think that was kind of what people expected from this team.
Yeah, last year I think, and you've said this before, last year was probably their window to win a title, and I mean they were probably close to getting there, but they didn't. Yeah, this year it's hard to say what Simmons is going to mean to them. I mean, I think it's probably a good position for him, but I mean, I wouldn't go out there and say that makes them already like legit contenders that we weren't seeing earlier.
I talked about during the trade deadline episode, especially with them grabbing Drummond and Seth Curry. They're a more complete team now. Now, whether that means that they're better or not will remain to be seen. But on paper, this is a more complete basketball team. But I guess the counter argument to this is like nobody would have expected Harden to like ask out 13 months into this thing. But at the same time, like feelings get hurt sometimes with these teams. Next up, we have the second stint in Cleveland for LeBron, the Kyrie, LeBron, Kevin Love group. LeBron signs with the team in free agency. Kevin Love is traded and gets traded for kind of a big haul at the time. Anthony Bennett and Andrew Wiggins, 2 former first overall picks. In the case of Wiggins, he hadn't even played a game yet. Granted, I think at that stage, even it was kind of a huge question mark on what Anthony Bennett would be. He didn't exactly light the world on fire his rookie year, but I still think at, only entering his second year, he was still seen as an asset. And then Andrew Wiggins was kind of the hype around him was being compared to LeBron. Like he was the most hyped prospect since LeBron at the time. And for just some context for those who weren't around for that, I would say the hype for Wiggins was less than Zion, but definitely closer to Zion than it would have been for like a Cade Cunningham. How do you
Yeah,
feel?
for sure. Yeah, I do remember that.
Yeah,
Yeah, he was. I mean, he was phenomenal at Kansas, so the hype was definitely there.
definitely a big asking price when you're talking about adding a guy like that. I mean, last 2 number 1 overall picks, that's huge. Also, Thaddeus Young was thrown into this deal, but who cares? Also Dion Waiters, he had shown some flashes at the time. Eventually he gets turned into like a J.R. Smith and Iman Shumpert thing. They get 3 years out of the Kyrie LeBron pairing and win 1 title. If unravels at the end because allegedly they were going to trade Kyrie for some combination of Paul George and Eric Bledsoe. So then they end up having to trade Kyrie for Isaiah Thomas, Jay Crowder, a prospect who at the time was thought he would be decent, and Zizic, but he never really pans out. And then the Nets first round pick from the KG Pierce Jason Terry trade that was supposed to be like a top draft pick, but didn't pan out. IT was never the same. Kevin Love really wasn't the same at any stage in the Cleveland stint. And it basically ends up becoming LeBron carrying the team year in and year out until they leave. So one title from this big three group. Do you feel like they lived up to the expectations?
Yeah, just because he only came back to win a title.
Okay.
I don't think it was there to build a dynasty or anything. Yeah, I mean, he was going for one title, at least one title, but I would say it lived up. I don't know if I would label them a super team or a dynasty though.
It definitely wasn't a dynasty, but I think, I mean, they fit the template for the super team, I would say. Kevin Love was in his prime. Kyrie was kind of entering his prime. He was still really young. And then you're obviously adding LeBron, who was maybe not quite in his prime, but I think closer
He was starting his second prime.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't know really what to do with his career. Next up on the timeline, we have the Miami Heat. 2 titles in 4 years. That isn't bad, but considering when they all got together, they had that big announcement, that big ceremony, and said they were going to win not 5, not 6, not 7. It's hard to really say that they lived up to expectations. And even though they won the 2 titles, they were far from unbeatable, even with 2 of the league's top 5 players in LeBron and Wade and a future Hall of Famer in Chris Bosh. They really only won in a semi-dominant fashion the Oklahoma City title. Like it was clear that Miami was the much better team. And even though they made it to 4 straight finals, they really had a lot of trouble in like a very watered down East. They had trouble early in the playoffs with Boston and early into that dynasty where it looked like they were going to be eliminated at times. And then later on, I don't know. I never felt like the Pacers series were in doubt, but they were close. A win's a win, but 2 titles is nothing to sneeze at. But narratively, when they got put together, it was treated as if this was unfair and the rules were going to have to be changed to free agency to protect the competitive balance of the league. They were just never an unbeatable team and were fairly lucky to win the 2 titles that they did, despite the media buzz around them.
I think 2 titles is probably just short of the expectations for them, just because of, that whole like pre-show of how many titles they're going to win together, and they're going to be just the dominant team for the next 7 or 8 years. I'd say they fell a little bit short on that end.
I hate this argument when people are arguing like LeBron and MJ for like who's the GOAT, that like Ray Allen saved LeBron and like he doesn't deserve that title. But it is worth mentioning, like they could have very easily won just 1 title. When the team was put together, I mean, ESPN was freaking out, of course, because this was kind of unprecedented. Three future Hall of Famers in their prime on the same team, but they were never unbeatable. They were a very beatable team. And this other YouTuber, Clayton Crowley, he does like this Making the Case series that I really like, where he talks about like who was the greatest team of all time, and he didn't include the Heat. And I was fine with that because watching them, like as a Heat fan, like I never felt completely safe with that team. I knew they were going to be there at the end, but you never knew that they were going to actually win the finals, actually pull it off. They were very beatable.
Yeah, especially when it came to those Spurs series. The Ray Allen game, obviously, that was one shot away from not getting that title, but the whole series really, they were being challenged. And yeah, the East, this was before the East was pretty competitive throughout, so you'd expect them to kind of run through, but they didn't.
Yeah, the East was really bad during this time. The Pacers, I mean, there was a brief stint where the Bulls were pretty competitive, but it was really only like 1 season from what I remember just off the top of my head. And even the Celtics, who the Heat really struggled with early on, they were on the back half of their competitiveness for sure. They were getting very old. let's see
And
here.
then ended
Next,
up breaking up on the 13 year anyway. The Celtics. That was kind of the end of the road for
yeah,
the KG
yeah,
Paul
and then it
Pierce
was
era.
that
So
Nets group that never really did anything, and like I don't know if they even took a game off the Heat in the playoffs. I know they played at least once, but they may have taken one game. It was at that stage that was like one of the better teams, and people thought of the Nets group as a title contender, but it was just never. They were too old, Pierce and Garnett and company. Last super team in this like modern era I want to mention is the '08 Celtics with KG, Ray Allen, Paul Pierce. I'd say check out the Doc Rivers is overrated video or podcast for more on that. But in essence, they get to the finals twice, win one, and that's about it. I can't say that they lived up to expectations. I think at the time the league
yeah,
was pretty watered down. A lot of they were far and away the best team for like the first few years of that.
yeah. I don't know what like the longevity of that team expectations were. 1 out of 2. I mean, you're not going to complain about it for sure, but in terms of putting together that one of the first big threes of the modern era and kind of creating what should be a dynasty, yeah, it didn't really pan out like that.
I just feel like the media just really goes nuts with this, and people on Twitter, like even when now that I'm on Twitter, when the Harden trade got made, everybody was ready to crown Philly the champs, and like I'm just like, whoa, like I
Yeah,
think we should pump the
yeah,
brakes a little bit.
yeah.
Um,
People are able to claim a winner of a trade pretty much right after they read the
yeah,
headline
I
nowadays.
know. Just a few honorable mentions of teams who didn't win titles. Those were all groups that won titles. We have the '04 Lakers, Gary Payton, Karl Malone, Shaq, and Kobe. They were only together 1 year. Kobe and Shaq had already won prior to Malone and GP getting there. So I guess it kind of fits the mold, but not really. We also have the second Lakers super team with like Gasol, Dwight, Nash, Kobe. The less said about them, the better. Mike Brown, who is their coach, gets replaced with D'Antoni after 5 games into the season. And D'Antoni's system was just really ill-equipped to deal with having 2 twin tower bigs. I know Powell eventually adds somewhat of a three-point shot later in his career, but at this stage he doesn't have it. So it's not as if they could like spread the floor like D'Antoni would like. Nash plays 50 games his first year, 15 the second year he's there. Howard is on a bad back and he needed surgery. So he was just kind of laboring out there. He just gutted it out. And the Lakers were expecting to get the Orlando version of him, but with his back, that was just not going to be the case. Kobe tragically ruptures the Achilles down the stretch, trying to just backpack this team into a playoff spot. And he was never really the same player after that. Last honorable mention I want to mention the Houston Rockets in the late 90s. They had Barkley and Drexler, who are all in their mid 30s with Hakeem. And then later on, they replaced Scottie Pippen with they replaced Clyde Drexler, who retired, with Scottie Pippen. Didn't really work out. Barkley and Pippen still hate each other today. They obviously never win a title. They make one conference finals with those interchangeable parts once Barkley is there. And that's about it. Now, if you've been paying attention, you might have noticed we left a certain team in California off the list named the Warriors. And I want to kind of explain why. So before they even add Kevin Durant, they have this big three of homegrown guys, more akin to like your classic dynasties, Spurs, '80s Lakers, teams like that. So by the way that we define this big three, they add Kevin Durant later. I think it's leaning more homegrown than like this modern Miami or Brooklyn style big three. And that's setting aside the fact that they had previously won a title, and the year before they add Durant, they go 73-9 in the regular season and were a LeBron superhuman chase down block away from winning back-to-back titles. Also, that's not even discussing like the perfect circumstances that allowed them to have the cap room to add Kevin Durant. Early on, Curry was a real question mark. He had sort of struggled, but mainly it was due to health issues on the court, just staying out there. And this allowed the Warriors to sign Steph Curry to a really team-friendly contract as he's becoming an MVP level player. Now, as if that isn't fortuitous enough, couple that with the fact that the salary cap in the league spikes in a major way, just increases crazy overnight, the same year that Kevin Durant is a free agent. So to add a little context, I've got some fun contracts here that were given out that offseason just to kind of illustrate how big the cap spike is. So we have 5 years, 130 for Andre Drummond, 5 years, 153 for Mike Conley, 4 years, 98 million for Whiteside. Chandler Parsons gets 4 years, 99 million. Some of those I feel like were slightly defensible. How do you feel?
No, I don't think most of those are defensible. That was the craziest day of free agency I've probably ever witnessed. Just the contracts people were getting. Nick Batum got 5 years, 120 that offseason as well with the Hornets.
Well, I've got the weird ones coming up here. I just like I feel like it's a lot, but like even maxing Mike Conley was like semi-defensible for like a small market team. Whiteside, I think, was pretty indefensible, but whatever.
Yeah, the Grizzlies had to do that with Conley. But yeah, I mean, you're going to get into the weird ones. That was just a wild offseason in terms of free agency.
Yeah, here's the weird ones that are not defensible. We got 4 years, 72 million for Bismack Biyombo, 4 years, 70 million for Evan Turner. The old retirement home version of Joakim Noah got 4 years, 72 million. I think this is the last year the Knicks are still paying him. The corpse of Luol Deng, 4 years, 72 million. I know that this is the last year the Lakers are paying him. And last but certainly not least, 4 years, 65 for Timothy Mozgov. Do you think he fell out of his chair when his agent presented him with that offer?
Yeah, he became agent of the year, I think, when that signing happened.
I can't imagine the case for giving, like, even if they wanted to give these guys like some pretty crazy numbers, I just don't understand the commitment of like 4 or 5 years to some of these guys. So
yeah, and
what
Mozgov had just come out of that finals where he kind of anchored the defense, I guess, is his argument.
About that, where he was like kind of important. Yeah.
I mean, but that doesn't justify the huge contract he got at all.
No, and like him dominating, or like I don't even feel like he dominated, but him like contending with Andrew Bogut, who I think is really underrated, but like he's far from like a focal point of the offense. So like him holding up okay on Andrew Bogut is not exactly a selling point. But basically the cap goes from 70 million to 94 million overnight. And you compare that to the salary cap today, it's at 112 million. So the cap has increased over, from 2016 till now by a lower amount than it did overnight that summer in 2016. So all of this to say, I'm not going to be counting them as a super team for like the big three template or using them as the case for like a homegrown team. I just think that the circumstances that they got put together, it just isn't replicable. And I want to say that never happens again, but the NBA is really weird. So maybe it happens again at some point, but it's probably never happening again.
Yeah, I don't know. Before they got KD, I mean, they drafted everyone that was part of that important core.
Yeah.
So that kind of brings different expectations than just going out and grabbing superstars off the market. Which is why like I could see the argument for that version of them not being a super team, just because they built that with what they had. They didn't go out and grab free agent until Kevin Durant, and that's when I would start labeling them as that super team once they got the best player in the world.
Yeah, but I don't think it's like, if you're going to use them, like if you're arguing that super teams are really good and are not overrated like we are, I think the Warriors are a really poor example to point to, because the circumstances which they got put together are really bizarre. Like it's not something that you could replicate. Like if you took over a team tomorrow, you're not going to be able to replicate the circumstances that allowed for that team to get put together. And then also, as you mentioned, 3 of those guys were in-house rookies, on up and grew together. And so it doesn't really fit the mold of the modern big 3 template. It's just a weird team to kind of work into this argument.
Yeah,
you could put them into either box. What's up?
If next year's cap goes to 150, like maybe you'll see something like that.
Right. I don't think after the
probably
pandemic that's going to be the case.
Yeah.
I think the owners would probably have something to say to that. So since the Celtics won the title in 2008, including them, how many super teams do you think have won a title excluding the two that the Kevin Durant Warriors won.
I mean, I'd go
Just
with the two
guess.
Heat. I'd go with the two Heat, and that's probably it. If we're excluding Kevin Durant, like you could maybe go with the Cavs. I don't know if I'd call them a super team, but I
I
mean,
would. I counted them. So if 4 out of
okay,
11.
four. What
Yeah.
was the fourth one?
So we have the '08 Celtics,
Oh,
then the two
counting the 08
Heats, and
Celtics.
then
Okay.
the Cavs. I think whether or not you agree that Kevin Love was part of that big three, I think the template in which they were, or kind of the way the roster was constructed, was at least with the intention that they were going to be a big three.
Yeah, it's the later part of that stint is kind of leaving a bad taste, I guess, is on that whole second rodeo with Cleveland.
Yeah, it never really worked out with Love. I didn't feel like he's kind of having a resurgence this year, but like not obviously to like an all-star level. That also wanted to note, I didn't count the Bubbles Lakers group as like a
I wouldn't count them
super
as a
team.
super team either.
Yeah, I would say that this year's version might fit the mold, but definitely not the bubble version. So in the height of like this super team era, like after the '08 Celtics really kicked this off, and then everyone's trying to put together the next super team. 36% of titles were won by a super team. That's not great. I still don't think that that's that high. And you compare that to the hype that gets kind of that formulates when one of these teams is put together for a 36% chance at winning a title, and that's pushing it even.
Yeah, and this year I don't think it's really set up that a super team is going to win this year either. I mean, do you consider Philly a super team?
No,
I don't either. I wouldn't call them that. Just, I mean, it's two guys. They're obviously both top
Tobias
10, top 5 players, but
I could argue for Tobias just because of his salary. Like it kind of fits the template. I mean, you could say that you could basically make the same argument that the Lakers aren't one this year for them, but I don't know. It would be kind of a stretch because it really wasn't put together with that in mind. I don't feel like.
Yeah, I agree. And the Lakers, like that was the intent, is what it felt like. It just the performance was not there.
I agree. So I want to get into why we feel like this isn't more successful. And I feel like we've talked about the Lakers this year, and I feel like they're the embodiment of everything that's wrong with this methodology to like building a team. So next year under contract, assuming that Russell Westbrook accepts his option, they have 4 guys: LeBron, AD, Russ, THT. They're also go ahead.
The problem with that is that's their whole salary cap right there with those 4 guys.
That's what I was getting ready to say. They're over the salary cap already for next season with those 4 guys. So outside of like adding a mid-level exception guy, which I don't even know if they have that option, I didn't look into that. They're looking at a roster full of minimum guys just like this year. I guess maybe Kendrick Nunn comes back, but considering he hasn't played this year for reasons that remain unclear to me, it looks like some mystery knee issue that nobody's really talking about. I don't really know how much I would expect from him going forward.
Yeah, they're a team that kind of shows the problem with getting all these max guys on the same team and then having no real kind of schedule for what you want to build your team to be when you have 12 open spots but no money to pay.
Right.
And the Nets too, we kind of saw. I wouldn't call them the salary issue, but I mean, when they started dealing with those injuries and the vaccine issue, how fast they just plummeted in the standings because they didn't have the depth.
Once Durant went out, he was just keeping them afloat.
Yeah.
And then they just bottomed out. But yeah, just this in general, this idea or methodology to building a team, it just puts so much pressure on your big 3 because you have a weak roster surrounding them. The Lakers, as an example, this year, Anthony Davis and LeBron have missed some time. And for the LeBron part, he is a superhuman, but he's missed a lot of time because he's having to play point guard on offense and center on defense for long stretches. It's just not sustainable. With the Heat, when they had LeBron, this is prior to acquiring Birdman, we had we eventually shifted to Bosch at the 5, but before we did that, we had the joy of watching Joel Anthony play at the 5. And for those who don't know or remember who Joel Anthony was, he was an undersized center who was an okay defender and rebounder, I guess. But offensively, he had bricks for hands. And outside of literally a wide open layup, he couldn't make anything else. If he was contested on a layup, it wasn't going in. He had no shot whatsoever. And that's, of course, assuming that he caught the ball. So that's an example of like why the roster around the team is really weak when you build it through like this big three style. I also remember when I was a kid watching the 04 Lakers on their title run, I was clamoring for Luke Walton to get more minutes. Imagine the state of your team when you're clamoring for and desperate for more Luke Walton minutes.
Yeah, that's a tough situation to be in.
Yeah, well, Devian George was just like not doing anything. So we're like, why aren't they playing this kid, Luke Walton, this rookie? He seems like he's solid for them when he plays. And it's just like they didn't have any other options. They had really just thinned it out to get old Karl Malone and old Gary Payton. But it also really thins out your future assets. So we saw at the trade deadline after the Lakers acquired Russ, they just had no tradable contracts, and then they had no picks or future assets because they had to give them all up in the Anthony Davis trade. The Heat, when they put their big three together, they gave up a former number 2 overall pick and just gave him away. That was Michael Beasley. It was after his second year, and he was coined like the next Kevin Durant coming out into the draft. So to give up on him, and I think we traded him for like a second round pick just to get him out the door to clear up the cap room to make it work. That's crazy to do. A former number 2 overall pick after entering his third year worked out at the end, but still, that's like a pretty hefty price to pay. It just backs you into a corner with the potential roster improvements you can make, and you end up with a situation where you have high turnover on the roster year after year and very little flexibility for free agents or trades.
Yeah, and I think another like way to look at this is look at the teams who aren't going this route and are having success, like the Suns or even the Heat, who had to dip into their G League bench for half the season and are now like one of the top contenders just because they have that depth that's all around, not even just on their NBA bench.
Yeah, we've probably got the best like player development.
If anything, that's definitely what it showed.
Yeah. I just feel like the Daryl Morey philosophy here is just like, we're going to get star players in here and figure the rest out later. I'm just really questioning whether that works. I think the Lakers, again, are a really good example. Like AD and LeBron fit together like a glove, but you add one odd piece in Russell Westbrook and this whole thing fell apart.
Yeah, and AD is not even part of the picture for most of the season anyway.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you have to kind of weather his inevitable injuries. And even with the big three Heat, they're one of the more successful teams when you actually dive into the numbers that kind of fit this template. Fit-wise, it never really made a lot of sense. And for them, like Wade had to become an off-ball cutter, roll man on a pick and roll guy. And Bosch had to completely change his game, replacing like his post-up touches with a three-point shot. And that's the only reason that it worked. So when you're grabbing star players, that's a huge assumption to make that everyone is on board with changing the way that they play. And they won't want to just revert back to the things that have made them successful throughout their career.
Yeah, I think that's the hardest part, because how are you going to tell a guy who's making $40 million a year kind of to change his game, you know?
Yeah.
I think that's kind of what's happening in LA right now.
So the Heat guys, to their credit, did that. But outside of LeBron, who they kind of all agreed was the best player and shouldn't change his game, but he did the first year. He was more of like a pass first point guard and he's still putting up big numbers, but it was definitely Wade's team and he was definitely the primary option. But I don't know, that's just a huge assumption to make, that your star players are going to change the way they play to make it work. And I just feel like when you're putting a team together, you have to have some idea of how they're going to play together. And the coach, the front office, the players, everyone needs to be on the same page with the vision. The Suns this year, as you mentioned, they were put together with a really specific vision in mind and pieces that all make sense together. The results, they look like a well-oiled machine, and it's just, it makes sense. It all makes sense.
Yeah, with the exception of Chris Paul and Crowder, I mean, most of their talent was drafted. And I think
That
that goes
too.
into a big part of like kind of growing that team with the same vision, is they're all part of the same process. The coaching staff is the same, the front office is the same, So it's works out a lot easier when you do it that way rather than just grabbing guys together and then trying to make it work.
With Jay Crowder, I mean, he's a role player that fit what they wanted to do really well. So they had a specific intention and vision in mind when they grabbed him. Same thing with Chris Paul. It wasn't a case of, well, let's just grab a star player because we need to grab a star player. It was they clearly had a vision for how he was going to fit in with that team. Like they clearly wanted to get Devin Booker off the ball a little bit more. And they were going to use Chris Paul to do that. They wanted to run a lot of pick and rolls with DeAndre Ayton. It made sense, and they had a plan in place. It wasn't just like, we'll just grab him and him and him and we'll
Right.
figure it out when we get here.
Yeah,
And
those two signings were really awesome, I guess, for what they wanted, and it showed because they obviously meshed together right away.
right. I think it makes way more sense to kind of put a team together that makes sense. And that seems silly to say, but that's not what a lot of teams are doing. They're just grabbing players, grabbing good players, and hoping that they can figure it out later. But they're not putting any thought into, well, how is this all going to work?
Yeah.
I also want to bring up like the chemistry aspect of like bringing in three alpha dogs and the assumption that that's going to result in a happy locker room. It's made a huge difference this year. We've seen with the Lakers, I keep using them as an example, but they're really, as I mentioned, the embodiment of everything that's wrong with this methodology. It looks like they hate one another and just hate life in general when they're out there playing basketball. And you contrast that with the Grizzlies, who are way less talented on paper, but they all hang out outside of basketball and enjoy each other's company. It just really shows on the court when you're watching the team play, and also the results. The Grizzlies are fighting for the second seed in the West this year, way ahead of schedule. And the Lakers, who I think even if you were pessimistic about this team, I don't think you would have had them in the play-in to start the year.
Yeah, no, I mean, you'd always think they would do well with the players they had. I mean, the signs were right there when they signed Russell Westbrook. I just chose to ignore them.
I know,
Um,
I know the writing was all over the wall with the Lakers
yeah,
this year. I'll never forgive myself for that take.
yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I picked him to win, so
So I at least didn't do that. I picked the Nets
yeah,
because I just kind of backed into the Nets. I'm like, well, if they're healthy, they're most likely going to win. And like, I didn't really feel strongly about anyone else. Like,
yeah, and that's the way you have to do it. You can't make if you're gonna make a prediction, you have to go off health. You can't really just expect injuries to come or you expect vaccine mandates or something like that.
yeah, yeah, that was before the vaccine mandate thing. Oh boy. And also to kind of piggyback off of the chemistry thing, there's two ways that it goes with these super teams where you have like the Lakers this year or the Kobe and Dwight situation, also the Nets situation this year. I felt like where there were just too many cooks in the kitchen and everybody was kind of wrestling for more touches, more shots, more whatever. And like everybody's kind of acting out in their own interests, out for their own self interests. And then you also end up with a situation like the early Miami Big Three, or even like the Dream Team, a scenario where everyone is being not selfish enough and is wanting to defer just to not step on any toes or offend anybody. They don't want to appear selfish and cause issues, so they kind of over defer. I think the biggest issue, though, is assuming that you can actually pull this off. So I mentioned the Heat gave up Michael Beasley, just gave him away to make the cap room to sign Wade, LeBron, and Bosh. But that isn't really factoring in the years of prep that they put in to lay the groundwork for that. Moves like moving Sean Marion for the corpse of Jermaine O'Neal in order to get all the contracts aligned so that they were all expiring on the same year. Also, everyone has to want to sign with you or be traded to you. So that rules out the smaller market teams. And even with the bigger market teams, there's no guarantee this works. The Knicks have tried to do this year after year. They tried to do it basically in place of the Heat in the early 2010s by signing Amari Stoudemire, who had no knees at the time, and hoping that was going to coax LeBron into coming over. And then the Knicks have also just recently failed with Kyrie and KD. And what did that cost them? At least with the most recent example, they had to give up Kristaps Porzingis, who I know right now he isn't seen as much of an asset, but at the time he was thought of as a future star in the league. And they got a few crappy draft picks and some salary dump stuff that was going to allow them to hopefully sign, make big splashes in free agency. And then they end up signing Julius Randle and now Kemba Walker and Evan Fournier.
Yeah, and one of those guys isn't even playing the rest of the season, so it didn't really end up working out anyway.
No. I just think it makes a lot more sense to like slowly build a team around the pieces you have, be patient, let young guys develop.
It's hard to do that. I think the media has a lot to do with that too, because we come in with so much expectations of rookies and moving, someone over the offseason to make an immediate impact, but it does take time.
Particularly with the Knicks, like they can't really afford to be patient, but they've sucked for years. If they had like not sucked for years, then fans and media would be more patient.
Yeah.
But I just look at how special the Bucks title felt last year. It was a group that had failed in the postseason year after year, and they worked together to get over that hump. And it feels so much more earned. And I think there's something to be said about like a group sharing like those experiences, like going into the playoffs and not quite getting there and having letdowns and having disappointments. And then there's more camaraderie built than when you're experiencing those things on your own team. And then all of a sudden you're put together.
Yeah, that's definitely a true point. And I don't know if like for this year, if like Brooklyn were to win the title or if Philly were to win the title, I don't know if I would feel that way about them just because of the way they put their teams together. Like,
no, because all of those guys, while they've all had playoff letdowns,
right,
they've all experienced them separately from the team that they're on, maybe with the exception of Kyrie and Durant, just because they had last year. But just if you think about like the really great dynasties we've had in the league, the Kobe Shaq Lakers, they got beaten up on by Utah before they finally got over the hump. The Jordan Bulls, they had the Pistons. They were losing year after year to the Pistons, and then once they finally got over the hump, then they started rattling off title after title after title. And then even the Spurs, they had the Kobe Shaq Lakers to kind of get through, and that was when they kind of entered their dynasty. And they did, I guess the Kobe Shaq Lakers kind of broke up for the Spurs thing at some point, but they still won a title while that team was together and in their heyday. So all the great dynasties have been a story of slowly building something special rather than like overnight and almost unearned success, like success story like that. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I agree. It's hard to wait to build something like that. It seems like a lot of teams kind of want to take the 2K approach and just put together what they can, act like it's a video game, and that the chemistry aspect won't really affect it. You just have two or three great stars and you're going to be a contender.
Yeah.
I think kind of, letting them build out, seeing how players develop, fitting them into a role that you can kind of build a strategy around it definitely lasts longer and it has proven to work a little bit better.
Well, even with the Bucks, I know Holiday wasn't there for all of that. He was a later addition, but Middleton and Giannis were the Bucks. Like it really felt like they were the embodiment of what they were, and they had some real disappointments. And the Holiday piece was just the last guy they needed to kind of get over the hump. But the core and what that team was and how they played, that had been there for years. And it'll be the same.
Even if they don't win again, I feel like that would still be a success.
Right. And even which they may. I mean, they've got a really good team this year. They've kind of had some bumps at times, but they've not had a ton of games with their big three. I hate to use that term for this video, but the Holiday and Middleton and Giannis haven't played a ton of games together. But even with the Suns, like if the Suns get over the top this year, like they had that shared experience last year where it was a huge letdown. And for the Booker and Ayton piece and Bridges, like those guys have been there in the lottery, year after year. And then they kind of took a step forward in the bubble where they probably should have made the playoffs, but they were just a little too far out. But that was their first like competitive year. And now it looks like they've shared that experience and now they're really special. All great stories are about the journey and not just the ending. And I feel like team building is no different.